Number 1.
It was March 13, 1980, when John Wayne Gacy was convicted of 33 murders. The former contractor, aspiring politician, and part-time clown seemed guileless until Chicago police searched the cramped crawlspace beneath his house. They unearthed the bodies of teenage boys and young men, who were later found to have been sexually assaulted and murdered. Some still remain unidentified, and there are possible victims who were never accounted for. Gacy was sentenced to death and executed in 1994. The specter of the man often called the killer clown still haunts Chicago. Not everything is known about the horrific crimes committed in the darker half of Gacy's double life. Police did not take missing persons reports seriously until they actually found corpses, and there may have been more victims. There is one mother who was told her son's remains were found only to realize he had never been properly identified. She is still searching for him. From faces without names to the debate over whether Gacy was born a killer or grew into one from years of abuse, alcoholism, and even epilepsy, these are the questions left unanswered. The problem with convictions is that they don't always reflect how many crimes were committed. The Peacock documentary Devil in Disguise reveals a recording of John Wayne Gacy that may mean he had something to hide. When investigator Raphael Tover asked the killer clown how many people he really killed, Tover told NBC News that Gacy's response was 45 sounds like a good number. When he asked Gacy where the bodies were, he was met with, "No, that's your job. You got to find out." It didn't help that Gacy was suspected to have been misleading authorities. Karen Conti, who would eventually be the killer's death row attorney, remembers him sending police on a labyrinthine search. "That was typical Gacy," she said in Devil in Disguise. "Sort of like, don't look over here, look over there." Others who were on the case think he could have buried bodies elsewhere. Conti also said she thought all along we were going to find more bodies attributed to Gacy. It is possible that if there were unknown murders, the bodies were never found, because they were thought to exist at the bottom of society's hierarchy. As psychologist Sherry Hammy told Oxygen, Gacy took advantage of this since victims who fall under this stereotype are less likely to be missed. During John Wayne Gacy's trial, his mental health was debated, but some self-incriminating things he told authorities couldn't possibly be ignored. Attorney Bob Motta Jr., son of Bob Motta, one of the lawyers on Gacy's defense team, got a hold of unedited interview tapes. He had time to think about what to do about forming some kind of theory for defense in his own mind. The younger Motta reveals in his podcast, The Defense Diaries, via NBC5 Chicago, Gacy admitted he would drink heavily and wake up hungover, only to find a body on the floor. He had no recollection of killing anybody, and blamed either his alter ego, Jack Hanley, or the victims themselves for not knowing better. Psychologist Donald Black said Gacy had antisocial personality disorder in his book, Bad Boys, Bad Men, via Stanford University magazine. Gacy was ultimately deemed to have known what he was doing. The American Justice documentary John Wayne Gacy, Buried Secrets recalls that witnesses who testified led the prosecution to believe Gacy proved his own sanity by leading an outwardly normal life while killing young men. If you or someone you know is struggling with mental health, please contact the crisis text line by texting HOME to 741,741. Call the National Alliance on Mental Illness helpline at 1-800-950-NAMI, 6264, or visit the National Institute of Mental Health website. At one point, John Wayne Gacy worked as a maintenance man in a Chicago apartment complex, not far from where he lived. Former homicide detective Bill Dorsch started to grow leery when he ran into Gacy around 3 a.m. on a snowy night and noticed what he had clutched in one hand, via The Verge. It was not a snow shovel but a spade, which aroused Dorsch's suspicions that Gacy might have been digging in the dirt for whatever reason instead of clearing out snow. Gacy tried to pass this off as being a workaholic. Dorsch couldn't shake the suspicion and called the sheriff's office. He met with investigators and told them about knowing Gacy and seeing him around 3 a.m. holding a shovel, as he told the Shadow reports. Dorsch realized he had been right to suspect something. after bodies were dug up from the crawlspace beneath Gacy's house and recovered from the Des Plaines River, and it was years after Gacy's execution that Dorsch learned the Cook County Sheriff's Office had done absolutely nothing. Later, a 1998 radar scan around the complex revealed possible evidence of human remains, and Dorsch was the one who pushed for that to happen. There are still mysteries surrounding whether John Wayne Gacy himself killed every one of his victims. Some believe he acted alone. As Alec Wilkinson wrote in The New Yorker a year after Gacy's execution, Gacy insisted he couldn't have buried any of the bodies in the crawlspace because he was out of shape. Gacy tried to assert his innocence through claims of mental illness and pointing his finger at possible accomplices. According to Wilkinson, Gacy used his remodeling company as a cover for going out at night and pointed to his employees David Cram and Michael Rossi after 27 bodies were discovered in the crawlspace under his house. They were never convicted of any crimes. But no conviction doesn't necessarily mean no guilt. Gacy only seemed to be an upstanding citizen by day. After dark, he would stalk the neighborhood for potential teenage victims and lure them into his car with a fake police badge via John Wayne Gacy. Buried secrets. Cram and Rossi were never proven to have been accomplices in the murders. It is possible that things that happened to John Wayne Gacy irreversibly changed him. Richard Rappaport, chief psychiatrist for the defense, told A&E True Crime that Gacy was ruthlessly abused by his father, who was a heavy drinker. As his sister Karen told reporters in Devil in Disguise, while John was not the only one to succumb to his father's violent outbursts, he was still the main target. When he drank too much, John got the brunt of it, she said. A 1984 study published in University of West Virginia Law Review examines whether epilepsy also had something to do with Gacy's behavior. Gacy was 20 when he first went to the hospital complaining of back pain and headaches. Records referenced in the study say he had hysterical blackouts, during which he remembered nothing, and others said he began to shake intermittently. Hospital staff needed to hold him down and sedate him, and he no longer remembered what had happened after about a week. Gacy's violent seizures continued. In the following years, he ended up hospitalized several times, attacking staff as he did before, and he was given strong sedatives to keep him from possibly inflicting harm on anyone. Whether he slipped into such blackouts when he killed is still unknown. John Wayne Gacy was deceptive because he seemed like the last person anyone would suspect. When Joe Berlinger, who directed the Netflix documentary Conversations with a Killer, spoke to Netflix Tudum, he said, "Just because somebody looks trustworthy doesn't mean they are." And I think Gacy epitomizes that. According to history, there seemed to be nothing off about a man who, despite a 1968 stint in prison for sexual assault and a failed marriage, appeared to have it together. He was such a model prisoner he was released early, and Chicago lauded him for standing out in the community. He remarried, had children, and in addition to fronting his own remodeling company, he was a local politician. As reported by Inside Edition, Gacy would also put on a clown act for parties, and it seemed innocuous. Gacy would go on to murder some of his victims in that very same costume, earning him the nickname Killer Clown. Another reason Gacy almost got away with taking at least 33 lives is that many were thought to be runaways or male sex workers. According to Devil in Disguise, there was no outrage over young men going missing when they were already assumed to have taken off on their own. It didn't help that they were mostly gay men highly stigmatized at the time. As a WLS-TV reporter said in a 1978 clip included in the documentary, they came to him either paid or looking for a good time, and got more than they bargained for. Alec Wilkinson told The New Yorker that John Wayne Gacy was obsessively fond of defending his innocence, which is imaginary. Gacy often spoke to the media, but insisted he had not committed most of the murders. Some of this is revealed in a transcript from a CBS News interview with Gacy not long before he was executed. The prolific killer insisted there were several reasons he couldn't have been responsible, and pointed to his image as a family man. He admitted to so much as knowing about 5 of the murders, and said he was no more than an accomplice who threw one of the bodies in the river, despite the fact that he confessed much more incriminating things to the police right after he was arrested. Even his claim of taking the truth serum, otherwise known as sodium amyl, is thought to have been a lie. Joe Berlinger, director of the Netflix documentary Conversations with a Killer, the John Wayne Gacy tapes, knew Gacy kept lying in his interview, but didn't stop the camera. As Berlinger told Netflix Tudum, he wanted the killer to keep going, because listening to how he spun things is a fascinating portrait of a sociopath, because a sociopath feels no remorse and always blames other people. While John Wayne Gacy may have lied about his innocence, that doesn't mean he operated alone. He apparently associated with other criminals who hunted teenage boys. According to the Toronto Sun, another employee of his, Philip Pask, sparked the suspicion of the police. It turned out that Pask's boss was notorious child sex offender John David Norman. Not only did Norman sell child pornography, but he also ran a sex trafficking ring for men seeking much younger prey. As the Toronto Sun notes, the Candyman Dean Corll, who had 28 known victims, was supposedly another accomplice of Norman's, and also one of his customers, before Gacy entered the scene. Police eventually found out that 2 of Gacy's victims were last seen alive with Norman. This pushed them to investigate further, and led them to think Gacy was somehow involved with Norman and procured young victims from him. As Gacy's death row attorney Karen Conti recalls in Devil in Disguise, Gacy tried to shift at least some of the blame to Norman, and alluded to the idea that there may have been a snuff film operation, and that some of these young men and boys were being killed and videotaped. Gacy denied any involvement. Conti initially found it hard to believe him, but she soon realized that the possibility of a thriving black market for these films in the 70s meant there might have been truth to this. There have been arguments that the police refused to believe what was going on. Jeffrey Rignall was one of John Wayne Gacy's few surviving victims, and according to the crime library, via the Clark County Prosecutor's Office, Rignall was sedated with chloroform, and would intermittently wake up to see a naked Gacy sexually abusing him. When Rignall informed the police, they didn't exactly believe him. Local authorities remained in denial of the horrific crimes happening around them. As Ret News anchor Jay Levine told Peacock in Devil in Disguise, gay men faced a massive stigma during the 70s, and because they were kind of an underclass, when it came to the case mounting against the deceptive killer, this stigma affected the way it was reported and the way it was treated by law enforcement. Most of Gacy's victims are now believed to have been either male sex workers or gay men he randomly picked up, making the victims seem like runaways only worked against them, and the police usually brushed off the missing person reports, even though Gacy was often linked to those cases. Sometimes detectives even went off what Gacy told them when they questioned him. If he was caught, he was soon released, only to kill again and again. Before John Wayne Gacy ever turned into a serial killer, he served what was supposed to be a 10-year prison sentence for sexually abusing a minor, then called morals charges in the local newspaper, via newspapers.com. He was also involved in politics at the time, insisting that the teen had consented. He tried to turn the attention of police to members of a political group he headed, via Crime Plus investigation. Gacy said the accusations had been made up by members of that group, who wanted to see his downfall. If what happened between Gacy and the teenage boy, Mark Miller, was consensual, then why did Gacy set an attacker on Miller after eluding law enforcement? Gacy finally pled guilty to the sexual abuse charge. Devil in Disguise reveals that he also tried to convince police what happened with Jeff Rignall was consensual, and they bought it. Even after the murders, Gacy was still appealing other charges of sexual abuse and assault, which is documented in the 1984 cases Nieder v. Gacy and People v. Gacy, via the Clark County Prosecutor's Office, which also detailed numerous other incidents of sexual torture and physical abuse. In Devil in Disguise, Raphael Tover, who was then a detective with the Des Plaines Police, told Peacock he remembers that after Jeff Rignall pleaded for help, his colleagues dismissed the claims because they assumed all sexual arrangements between gay people were consensual. Michael Marino was 14 and on his way to a nearby arcade when he vanished around the same time that John Wayne Gacy was luring in victims, only to kill them. USA Today reports that he was first dismissed as a runaway, but police later apologized to his mother, Sherry Marino, telling her that one of Gacy's victims had been identified as her son. It didn't end there. Forensic odontologists thought they had found Michael's body after dental analysis, and the radiologist who x-rayed the remaining bones came to the same conclusion. But Sherry Marino was far from finding closure. She felt that whoever was buried under the headstone with her son's name was not actually Michael, but another victim who had been mistaken for him. Sherry had reasons to believe that Michael had never been found, including a collarbone injury in the victim's medical records, something that had never happened to her son, and the lack of a DNA match. The problem was that the DNA test was not considered legitimate. The identity of victim number 14 remains a mystery. Michael's friend, Kenneth Parker, who was headed to the arcade with him, was Gacy victim number 15, as the Chicago Tribune mentions, though the death certificate in Michael's name cannot be changed unless there is indisputable forensic evidence that the remains thought to be Michael's actually belonged to someone else. His mother still has a feeling the remains were misidentified. There is no evidence for the additional victims John Wayne Gacy claimed to have killed, and then teased police about. However, among his 33 known victims, 5 have still remained unidentified, since the case that was closed after his 1993 execution was reopened in 2011. In late 2021, ABC 57 News put out a call for anyone who could help put names to the faces of these victims, after a 6th body was finally identified as Francis Wayne Alexander earlier that year. The news channel also shows facial reconstructions of what 2 of the teenage victims would have looked like. These sketches were released by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in 2018, along with whatever details could be made out from their remains, such as dental fillings. The Cook County Sheriff's Office also asks for help in identifying these victims from anyone directly related to them, who might be able to offer a DNA sample that could make a connection to one of them. They also want to hear from anyone who had a male relative go missing between 1970 and 1979. Gacy was released from a previous prison stint in 1970, and after that, young men kept disappearing from areas around Chicago.
Number 2.
Charles Albright is far from being the most notorious serial killer in American history. His list of victims only includes 3 women, all known prostitutes in Dallas, Texas. What makes him stand out was he committed his first murder at the age of 57, and more importantly the manner in which it was carried out. In December of 1990, 33-year-old Mary Lou Pratt's partially clad body was discovered in the Oak Cliff neighborhood of Dallas. Some reports say she was 35. The children who stumbled across the mutilated woman at first thought she was a mannequin. She was wearing only a t-shirt and shot in the back of the head. Both eyes had been surgically removed without as much as a mark on the eyelids. There had been no bleeding and only 2 small cuts. Apparently, the killer had taken them with him. It would become his trademark signature. According to criminal behavior experts, the crime had been committed simply for pure sadistic gratification, and the eyes taken as souvenirs. Being knowledgeable in such matters, they realized it was just a matter of time before the euphoria of the murder wore off. Chances were the perpetrator would once again be prowling the streets in search of another victim. Charles was born August 10, 1933, and was subsequently adopted by Del and Fred Albright. His mother, a school teacher, was very strict and overprotective. She sometimes dressed Charles as a girl and gave him a doll to play with. Young Charles was once given a gun. He killed small animals with it and expressed a desire to become a taxidermist. His mother taught him how to skin and stuff his dead animals. However, his mother was thrifty and wouldn't purchase the expensive glass eyes sold in taxidermy shops, so he had to use buttons or black marbles. Some analysts say this may have been the root for his obsession with eyeballs. His mother continued to push him hard in his studies, which enabled him to skip 2 grades. But although he was a bright lad, he was also a petty thief, and by the time he was 13, he had been arrested for aggravated assault. Albright graduated from high school at 15, but by this time he had already added forgery to his list of talents. He fraudulently signed his way into North Texas University. Shortly thereafter, he was arrested and incarcerated for robbing a store of petty cash and some firearms. Apparently, his sentence didn't teach him anything, because after being released, he just falsified some more bogus degrees and wormed his way into the Arkansas State Teachers College, only to later be found in possession of stolen goods and expelled. However, he wasn't prosecuted and continued with his wayward ways. Not long afterward, Charles is married, but he was never able to keep a job for long. He survived by forging checks and using fake credentials. For a while, he became a high school teacher using his forged documents, but he was soon found out, fired, and put on probation. But true to form, Albright was soon in hot water again. He was arrested for robbing a hardware store and got a 2-year prison sentence. But he was back on the streets after only 6 months. Eventually, his wife tired of his incorrigible lifestyle and dallying with prostitutes, and she left. They were officially divorced in 1974. In 1981, he was accused of sexually molesting a 9-year-old girl. Charles was prosecuted, but once again society was lenient and he was put on probation. In 1985, Albright met Gacy in Arkansas, and they moved in together. Naturally, it wasn't long before she was supporting him. In order to keep visiting prostitutes without Gacy becoming suspicious, Charles took an imaginary early morning paper route. It was in February of 1991 Albright's second victim, Susan Peterson, was found in similar manner as that of Pratt. Her body had been disposed of just outside city limits in South Dallas. Peterson had previously told a police officer she believed she knew who Pratt's killer might be. However, at the time she didn't give the name, so authorities were still at square one. By this time the media had begun calling the mystery killer, the Texas Eyeball Killer, the Dallas Ripper, and the Dallas Slasher. About a month later, the bruised, battered and bleeding body of Shirley Williams turned up near a school. Williams' eyes were also missing, but this time several witnesses who had seen Albright with Williams informed police. He was promptly arrested at his home, but the more authorities found out about Albright, the more they thought they had the wrong guy. At 57, he didn't fit the profile of a serial killer. Neither did the facts he had an alibi, a master's degree, spoke several languages, was a former science teacher, charming, and didn't abuse drugs or alcohol. Additionally, Albright had been a football coach and had participated with the Cub Scouts. Did they have the wrong man? Only a jury could decide. Charles Albright's trial started on March 22, 1991, and he almost got away with murder, because much of the evidence against him was circumstantial, almost except for one piece of irrefutable evidence tying him to the Williams murder. A few of his hairs had been found at the scene of the crime. On December 18, 1991, Charles Albright was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences, without the possibility of parole. Albright is now confined at the Clements Unit of the Texas Department of Corrections in Amarillo. He no longer corresponds with Gacy. He still exhibits an extreme interest in any news reports involving cases where eyes have been gouged or cut out. It's also reported he subscribes to a magazine about iridology, a scientific field which studies the iris of the eye. He also reportedly has the first issue of Omni featuring a large eyeball on the cover.
Number 3.
This is a dark and twisted tale of Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, responsible for the Moors murders in the 1960s in England. The story of these murders is something of a real horror story, and is not for the sensitive or faint-hearted. Ian and Myra's victims were between the ages of 10 and 17. In total, they abducted, sexually assaulted, and murdered 5 souls. These murders were calculated and executed with precision. There is nothing more chilling about a murder story than when the murder involves innocent children, who had to face such a traumatic end to their short lives. For a person to prey on a child who cannot defend themselves against an adult is nothing short of cruel, and is the epitome of evil. Ian Brady, born Ian Stewart, came into the world on 2 January 1938 in the slums of Glasgow. His biological mother, Peggy, was a waitress, while the identity of his biological father remains unknown. Peggy was a struggling single mother, and when Ian was only 4 months old, she posted an advert in the local newspaper, putting him for adoption. The Sloan family adopted Ian. Peggy would regularly visit her son. However, Ian was only told years later that Peggy was his biological mother. As Ian got older, he started to exhibit psychopathic tendencies. His disrupted childhood resulted in him having emotional outbursts, as he would often throw ferocious tantrums. Ian lacked empathy, especially toward small animals, which he would often torture and then kill. Some articles say that he loved animals and had his own dog that he was devoted to. However, this love and devotion did not extend to all animals, as he was known to throw stones at other dogs, decapitate rabbits, and on one horrifying occasion, he burnt a cat alive. Ian's desire to cause suffering was not a phase that he would outgrow. Ian's criminal tendencies continued into his adolescent years, despite being an intelligent young man and performing well at the Shawlands Academy. He often found himself in court being charged for theft as well as breaking and entering. The tendency to use violence to threaten and intimidate became more apparent as young Ian, on one occasion, threatened his teen girlfriend with a knife. After yet another round in court for theft, 16-year-old Ian was sent to live with his biological mother in Manchester. Soon after arriving, Ian took the last name of his stepfather, Patrick Brady. Once Ian Brady was settled in Manchester, he started to become obsessed with the Nazis. He would consume all German literature at a rapid rate. Brady was fascinated with Hitler and read his famous biography, Mein Kampf, several times. His family started to notice that Ian was not troubled by the atrocities of the Holocaust. Rather, he seemed to enjoy learning about how people were tortured in these camps. Ian Brady had vicious tendencies and enjoyed reading dark literature, which only inspired and fueled his sadistic mind. He went on to also read the works of Marquis de Sade. Marquis de Sade was a French author whose writing explored perverse sexual preferences and erotica, and his work actually gave us the term sadism. Ian continued to commit petty crimes around Manchester, where he was in and out of juvenile prison. This was until 1961 when Ian met Myra Hindley. Myra was only 18 years old when she began dating Ian Brady. She found him mysterious and was thrilled when he asked her out. With a 4-year age gap between the couple, Ian knew that Myra was persuadable, and he started to groom her. On their first date, he took her to watch the Nuremberg trails and would encourage her to read Mein Kampf. Myra, being so infatuated with Ian, started to adopt his viewpoints. Ian was her first boyfriend. She lost her virginity to him, and in her young and impressionable mind, this was true love. Myra was willing to do anything to please Ian. This included bleaching her naturally dark hair blonde, in an attempt to resemble the true Aryan race her Nazi-crazed boyfriend was obsessed with. Ian's and Myra's relationship was twisted. Myra would pose nude for Ian, and allowed him to take pornographic photos of her, as she was submissive, and Ian preyed on this. His sexual fantasies started to include violence, rape, incest, and pedophilia. Myra reported that on many occasions, he would take out his sadist tendencies on her. She would ask him why he would strangle her so often, to which Ian would respond that he was merely practicing. She told Ian that she was scared he would kill her, as he would apply too much pressure to her throat when strangling her. Ian reassured her that he would never kill her because he needed her. Ian had adopted the Sadian belief that murder is necessary and never criminal. He pushed this belief on Myra, and after Ian had moved in with Myra, they began to plan the perfect murder. Ian and Myra had read and studied the book Compulsion, about a young boy's real-life abduction and murder in Chicago. A book written as an argument against capital punishment became the blueprint for the Moors murders. They learned how the killers had gotten themselves caught, the techniques used, and how they would adjust these methods to create the perfect murder, which to some degree, they did succeed in doing until 1965. In June 1963, the couple's perverse crimes started. Myra would drive around neighborhoods in her and Ian's white van. Ian would follow behind on his motorbike. If Ian saw someone he liked, he would flash his lights at Myra, who would pull over and lure the victim into her van. There are two shocking points to note. Ian would often choose children as his victims, and two, the child often knew either Myra or Ian. Myra Hindley would offer a child a ride home, saying she knew their parents, thus establishing a sense of trust. Once in the van, Myra would drive out to Saddleworth Moor, a large open space just outside the urban area where Ian was waiting for her. Myra claimed that she would remain in the van, while Ian took the child into the moor, where he would sexually assault and then brutally murder them. Ian would then come back to the van to get Myra to help bury the children's bodies in a shallow grave. Pauline Reed was only 16 years old when Myra pulled up next to her in the white van. Pauline knew and trusted Myra as Myra was a friend of her older sister. Myra told Pauline that she had lost a glove out by the Saddleworth Moor and asked if she would come to help her find it. Pauline was happy to help and voluntarily got in the van with Myra and drove out to the Saddleworth Moor. The girl was met by a sadistic Ian who brutally raped and attacked her. He then slit her throat and stuffed the collar of her shirt into the wound. He and Myra then buried Pauline's brutalized body in a shallow grave in the moor. Pauline was the first of 5 people that would become victims of Ian and Myra. It was only 4 short months after the murder of Pauline when Ian and Myra were ready for their second victim. John Kilbride, a young 12-year-old boy, was approached by Myra. She asked if the boy could help her carry boxes to her car, and then offered him a lift home. John accepted the free ride and voluntarily got in the van with Myra. Myra then drove John out to the moor, where Ian was waiting. Once again, Ian assaulted and murdered the child. It was a year later when the couple attacked their third victim. In June 1964, 12-year-old Keith Bennett was picked up by Myra under the same pretense as John, to help carry boxes. Like their other victims, young Keith was taken to the Saddleworth Moor, where Ian assaulted and murdered him before burying his body in a shallow grave. That winter, yet another child became a victim of the sadistic couple. Little Leslie Ann Downey was abducted from an amusement park when she was only 10 years old. She met the same brutal end as Ian's other victims. Ian Brady's and Myra Hindley's final victim was 17-year-old Edward Evans. This would be their final murder before they got caught and arrested for their atrocious crimes. In the October of 1965, Edward was lured to Ian and Myra's apartment under the pretense that he would be engaging in a 3-way with the couple. Edward had dinner and drank wine with the couple. The couple was gaining Edward's trust, and his guard was being lowered with each sip of alcohol. Everything was going according to plan until Myra's brother-in-law David Smith arrived. David's unexpected visit to the house caused panic. He said that Myra was acting strangely toward him being there. David later told police that he had heard a loud thud coming from the living room, and when he pushed past Myra to investigate what was happening, he was met with a truly horrifying scene. Standing in the living room was Ian Brady hitting Edward's head with a hatchet. The noise David had heard was the first of several blows to Edward's head. David was shocked by the scene. However, to keep himself alive, he played along with the deranged couple. David helped Ian clean up the scene of the murder, all while Ian talked to David about his other victims. Ian confessed that he had murdered several others before and buried their bodies in Saddleworth Moor. Bewildered and albeit terrified, David finally left Ian's and Myra's house, telling them he would return in the morning to help dispose of Edward's body. This was all a ploy as David wanted to get away from Ian and Myra and call the police. The moment David arrived home, he told his wife Maureen about the events of the night. Maureen agreed that they needed to inform the police. David and Maureen feared their lives as they realized how dangerous Ian was. In an era before cell phones, the couple fled their home in fear that Ian would come to the house. Armed with a kitchen knife, David and Maureen found a phone booth to call the police and report what had happened that night. Ian was arrested on 22 October 1965, and 4 days later, Myra was also captured. The sadistic couple remained in police custody for 6 months awaiting trial. It was on the 27th of April 1966 that their trial began. Both Ian and Myra pleaded not guilty, despite a large amount of evidence against them. This included a tape where you can hear a young girl screaming and pleading for mercy as Ian and Myra assaulted and murdered her, as well as the bodies of 2 victims found at the Saddleworth Moor. Despite the evidence in David's statement as a witness to the murder of Edward Evans, the couple maintained their innocence, at least for a while. With all these testimonies, the couple eventually confessed. However, their stories contradicted each other. Ian claimed that he and Myra bonded over the murders, and that she enjoyed the killings. However, Myra said that she only went along out of fear for her own life. Regardless of Myra's attempt to portray herself as a victim, they were both found guilty of murder. The couple could only be charged for 3 of the 5 murders, as only the bodies of 3 of their victims were ever found. Myra was found guilty for 2 of the murders, while Ian was found guilty for all 3. Ian Brady and Myra Heinley were both sentenced to life in prison. The couple spent the rest of their lives locked up from society, where they both eventually died.
Number 4.
As someone who has always been interested in true crime and mystery, I had no hesitation in watching Netflix's newly released docu-series on serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer. Still, the first episode shocked me. I have watched almost all the true crime documentaries on Netflix, but this film was the first time where I felt genuine fear and shock through the screen. The acting and atmosphere created by the show frightened me, as if I was watching everything happen live. Monster. The Jeffrey Dahmer story has become the #1 show on Netflix globally, with approximately 192 million hours viewed, after its release on September 21st. The 10-episode limited series by Ryan Murphy and Ian Brennan is based on the true stories of the American serial killer, nicknamed the Milwaukee Cannibal. Dahmer killed 17 men and young boys between 1978 and 1991 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. His methods were notorious, as he would murder, rape, dismember, and consume his victims. He indeed was a monster. The show's timeline goes back and forth through Dahmer's childhood to his adulthood. The first episode specifically focuses on Dahmer, Evan Peters, picking up Tracy Edwards, Sean Brown, from a bar and taking him back to his apartment, where there are immediate red flags. There's a fish tank filled with dead fish, a bloody drill, and the horrific smell of decomposing flesh that Dahmer claims to be bad meat. Fortunately, Edwards is able to escape and call the police, leading to Dahmer's capture and the publication of his horrific crimes. After the first episode, which displays Dahmer's downfall, the show delves into his childhood, teenage years, family, and the beginning of his killings. While I will not get into the specific content, I do want to warn that, for some, the episodes may be hard to sit through. An important factor to keep in mind while producing true crime television shows or movies is to not romanticize or glorify the murderer. In 2019, Netflix released the movie Extremely Wicked, Shockingly Evil and Vile, starring Zac Efron. Like Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story, this movie was about serial killer Ted Bundy, Zac Efron, who murdered 28 young women. Instead of centering on the victims and crimes, the movie focuses more on Bundy's infamous charm toward women and his good looks. Some have argued that the movie did not portray him well as the villain that he was. Unlike the Ted Bundy movie, I do believe the portrayal of Dahmer in this film is not romanticized and is more authentic. Peters does a great job getting into the character for this role. Comparing his performance to real interviews conducted with Dahmer, Peters nails every mannerism, from Dahmer's breathing to the way he speaks. While watching him, you can sense the fear and tension yourself through the screen. You feel unease through the entire show. While the series has gained wide popularity, there have also been some major critiques from the viewers. Many people have spoken out on social media platforms such as TikTok and Twitter about the issue this series has caused. For the Milwaukee community, as well as friends and family of the victims, this show is ripping off the band-aid of an unhealed wound. Rita Espel, the sister of one of the victims, wrote to Insider that the show, it brought back all the emotions I was feeling back then. To make matters worse, Espel said Netflix did not reach out to the families for permission, or even give a heads up. There are real people impacted by Dahmer's crimes. The stories and pain caused by Dahmer should not be viewed as pure entertainment or be used to make money. Families of the victims should have been told about the making of this piece. They deserve the respect and should have been considered by the producers. However, in reality, the film industry has centered many shows and movies around serial killers, like Bundy and Dahmer. Many producers have used the real stories to make content that is alluring to the audience. Although true crime is interesting to learn about, there are better ways to educate ourselves with these topics, without hurting the victims or giving attention to the killers. The victims were not fictional characters. They were real people just like us, with friends and families.